Hello everyone. Welcome to Property Experts, where we provide you information related to property in a sensible manner. Hence, before purchasing property worth lakhs and crores of rupees, please do watch our videos to prevent yourself from falling under any sort of a scam or a fraud. Now, in this video, we are going to discuss a very simple yet very important topic. What is the difference between a lease and a rent? For example, should we sign a lease agreement or a rent agreement on the house we want to take on rent? If we want to rent a car in our business, so we will call it on lease or we will call it on rent. So many times this kind of confusion occurs. In this video, we will try to clear this confusion. What is the difference between a lease? What are the advantages and disadvantages? Where you should use lease and where you should use rent? Keep watching this video to know more. First of all, let us understand the difference between a lease and a rate. What is the main difference between them? See, lease is always used for the long term. If you rent any assets which you are taking for more than 12 months, so you will use the lease term, the lease agreement signed, or we can also call it to a lease deed. For example, if you take an office building for your business on rent, then you sign a long-term lease for 3 years, for 4 years, for 5 years or 10 years. There can be a 15-year lease agreement. Similarly to the airline industry, leases are used a lot in the airline industry. Airplanes are taken on lease for 9 years and 10 years. Similarly, in the office where a lot of manufacturing work is done, equipment is rented there. Sometimes construction companies take some equipment for the long-term leases. So these are some examples where the lease is signed. Assets are taken on lease for a long term. Now on the other hand, if we talk about rent, so if you rent any assets for less than 12 months, it will be called as renting. For example, like you hire a cab of Ola or Uber. So that you hire for a few minutes or a few hours or a day. Or there are some apps like Zoom Car where you can hire a car for 1 or 4 days. If you have also similarly, I take an example of a construction business. If you have hired a crane, let's say for a day, or for 15 days, you will call it renting. Also, if you do it on a house agreement, you must have seen it on a 11-month agreement. There is also a rent agreement. So, usually a lease is always signed for the long term. And when you rent something for a short period, it's called renting. But yes, these terms are sometimes used and it are interchangeable. You can also hear a 6 months lease at times. And you may also get a here 2-year rent agreement. But if you see on a broad level, the lease is always signed for a long term, usually for 12 months or more than it. And rent agreement is always signed for less than 12 months. Now let's try to understand in more details. And because the lease is signed for long term, usually the lease who is taking the asset for rent, he is also responsible for its maintenance. Whereas if you rent, like if you look a car or if you took a car for rent, if you have taken Ola or Uber, if you take the example of these, the maintenance is done by the owner. So you can say that lease is responsible for the maintenance of the lease. That is the one who is renting it. And in renting it is the responsibility of the owner for the maintenance. Now let us understand the negative and the positive points of both. See, because you are signing the lease for the long term, that means you have locked its price. If you have taken an office building or a house for rent, so you locked its rent for a long term. You are sure that the rent will not increase all of a sudden. But in the case of renting, the rate can also increase every month. Suppose if we talk about prices of Ola and Uber. So even daily the prices fluctuate. And similarly if you take a car for 1 month. So your rent for 1 month has come, but if you take it in the next month, then its rent may increase. Even if the rent increases in the house, so the landlord says that either you vacate my house or else increases the rent. So there is more flexibility in terms of renting. But in the case of the lease, we can say that the surety is high and the security is high for lesser and lease. And the second thing you have to take care of, that an agreement is renting can get terminated very soon. The agreement can also be terminated by giving short notice. So if we talk about house agreements, usually a 1-month clause is given so that agreement can break by the landlord. And tenant by given 1 month notice, so does this not happen in the case of lease. Because if in the middle of the lease, let's say if the lease is for 10 years, so if the tenant or landlord breaks it in the middle, so the penalties are maintained quite high. There could be a penalty of 6 months rent. There could be a penalty of 1 year. Apart from this, a clause is also inserted in a lease that the lease, that is one who is renting it, he can also become an owner in the future. If he makes the payment at the value of an asset of that time, which is also called as hire purchase system, but this is not possible in the case of renting. In the case of renting, the owner is always the owner. Tenant can't become the owner right away. Even in the rent agreement, no such clause is written. So this is some difference you should know and you should definitely keep in your mind. If you are renting and renting any assets, whether you should take a lease or take it on rent. If your agreement or requirement is short term, then you should definitely rent. Maybe it's like a bit high if you're taking it on a rent for a short term. But if you don't have its use for some time, so it is of no use taking it for a long time. On the other hand, if you want to use an asset for a long term but you don't want to buy it, so lease can be of a very good option for you. There is security for lessor and lease that the asset has been booked for such a period, and it becomes advantageous for the tenant itself. If we say for lease, so the price gets locked for him. So if you rent an asset in the future, keep all these things in mind. Hope you like the video. Thank you so much for watching. Do watch all our videos so that every doubt of yours is cleared which centers around property. Thank you.
Watching.
Any property related help, please contact us. Thank you.